Well, hello everybody, and thanks a lot for coming along to this research integrity workshop. So I'm Patricia Murray, and I'm just going to give a short introduction, and then I'll be introducing the first of our speakers, David Sanders, and then Peter Wilmshurst will give his talk. And then at the end, we're going to have a panel discussion focusing on some important questions. So just to start, yeah, so in case anybody doesn't know, in 2017 to 2018, the Science and Technology Select Committee conducted a research integrity inquiry. And I've just taken some of the conclusions from their report. So the first one is, they say the available data on misconduct investigations suggests that serious research misconduct is rare, but it's impossible to be certain without better data. And I think the reality is it's probably not as rare as we'd like to think. They also say it's worrying that there seem to be so few formal research misconduct investigations conducted by universities. And they say we see a gap in the UK system for a body that can provide a means of independently verifying whether a research institution has followed appropriate processes to investigate misconduct. And one of the recommendations they had was that the government should ask UK Research and Innovation, UKRI, to establish a new national committee which could undertake this role. So a national committee has been set up, the National Committee on Research Integrity, or CORI, but the co-chair of this committee has told me that CORI will not be able to independently verify whether a research organisation has followed appropriate processes to investigate misconduct. So this is not really, what was keeping to the recommendation. And they say that a key part of their committee's work is to review and understand the current landscape, listen to views and understand national experience and look at available evidence. And they say this will help to inform a view about what might be most appropriate and beneficial for the research system as a whole. Now, myself and many colleagues from the UK feel that, well, this actually was already done as part of the Select Committee's inquiry. So do we really need to be seeking these views again? And surely the most important thing now is to implement the recommendations that were made. So why is there a need for a UK Oversight Committee? So I'm just going to mention a few reasons here. So one is the rise of paper mills, which I'm not sure if everybody's aware of this, but it seems that there's, quite large networks of individuals who are actually just publishing junk science, and researchers are tapping into this just to add papers to their CV. And quite a lot of this does come from Asia, but we shouldn't be too complacent because there are UK scientists who are part of these paper mills as well. Secondly, public money is being wasted by funding fraudulent science. And researchers are also being led down blind alleys. And this, of course, is a waste of time and resources. Fraudulent research can lead to patient harm. And just one example here is the Macchiarini case. So Macchiarini now has a criminal conviction is incomplete because there were other people involved in that scandal who have actually faced no consequences. And Peter Wilmshurst will say a bit about that in his talk. And then finally, another reason we need this committee is to protect whistleblowers, because we know that whistleblowers can suffer detriment, especially if they're raising concerns about research misconduct in their own institution. And I just want to mention the case of Dr. Rajai Al-Jahani, who raised concerns about research misconduct at the Royal Free and UCL, and as a result was made redundant, and the serious concerns that she raised were never looked into. So these are just some reasons why we desperately need this committee, because whistleblowers actually have nowhere else to go in the UK. And I just briefly wanted to point out some differences in the research misconduct documents that different universities have. So I'm given the example here of University X, and if you read the research misconduct proposal policy, it says the registrar will consider recommending that action be taken under the relevant disciplinary process against any member of staff or student who is found to have made frivolous, vexatious and/or malicious allegations of misconduct in research. This statement is repeated on 5 occasions in that policy. So if you're a person who's thinking about bringing a case, this might well put you off. In our university, that message is only appearing once. And if we look at the different policies at the definition of research misconduct, most things are appearing in all of the policies. So things like fabrication of data, plagiarism, appropriating the research of others. But in University X, submitting an accusation of research misconduct based on vexatious or malicious motives is also listed as an example of research misconduct. In the University of Liverpool, we don't have that listed, but instead we have failure of a member of staff or student to report an incident which has given rise to a reasonable suspicion of research misconduct is listed as one of our criteria. So if you're looking through these policies, you might well think again, if you're a person based in University X, about bringing a case, because of course it might be a matter of opinion whether the people in charge there consider it to be frivolous. Whereas if you read the policy from our university, it's not such a big disincentive to actually go ahead and submit an allegation. So this is just really to point out that there are differences, you know, between universities in the UK. And this is another reason why we need an oversight committee, so that things are standardised. So at the end of the 2 talks, these are some of the questions that we can discuss. I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Peter Wilmshurst, who's a consultant cardiologist from the Royal Stroke University Hospital, and he's been involved in exposing many cases of medical research misconduct, and he obtained the Annual Health Watch Award in 2003 for courage in challenging misconduct in medical research, and was the first recipient of the BMJ Editors Award in 2012 for persistence and courage in speaking truth to power. And he just told me recently that he's, after Ian Hislop, he's the person who's been sued the most in the UK.
Thanks. Yeah, that's sued for libel in the UK, that is. I'm sure people have been sued for other things. Anyway, thanks very much for the invitation to speak about research misconduct. In fact, Patricia rang me this week and said, I've looked at the delegates who've signed up for this, and we think that probably you ought to do this talk rather like a a Sesame Street edition. And she obviously took my silence as agreement, because she went on and said, I'd like specifically you to cover the letter F and speak about the 3 Fs of research misconduct. And by then my power of speech was returning. And I said, 3 Fs, I only know 2 Fs, falsification and fabrication. I said, what's the 3rd F? And she said, honesty. I said, there's no F in honesty. And she said, that's what I want you to tell them, but perhaps with less of your Cockney charm. So I'm going to speak about research misconduct, mainly in medicine. It's not advancing for some reason. Oh, it's gone. Sorry, I've got it. Okay. So we know that the reason for research misconduct is pressure to publish, or so they say. But it's more than that, really. It isn't just pressure. It's the fact that people know they will get away with it most of the time because they see other people getting away with it. And in fact, it's not just pressure to publish. In many institutions, as I'll talk about, there is actually pressure to fabricate. We know it harms patients and wastes resources. The effects are often more serious than people will admit. We say the prevalence is unknown, but it's obviously a larger problem than we care to admit. People say it's the bad apples, individuals, but in fact it isn't. It's usually a web of misconduct, although often individuals get the blame, and I'll point to this in a bit. And the problem is that journals, academic institutions, and medical industry, pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, conceal misconduct to protect their reputation, their products. And all of them rely on public confidence in the integrity of research. So no one involved in research wants to admit how dishonest research is. And we also hear this, science is self-correcting. And in fact, it's sometimes self-correcting, but any correction may be too late. If you're a patient getting the wrong drug now for your disease, the fact that in 10 years' time, we know that this was the wrong treatment, that's because someone fabricated the data. The fact that science is self-correcting doesn't really help you if you've died in the meantime. And an example of this is Don Poldermans, who worked at Erasmus Medical Center in Rotterdam, which is one of the premier, if not the premier, medical center in the Netherlands. And he led a number of trials. He was on the steering committee of and leader of the DECREASE trials, the acronym there, which suggested that perioperative use of beta blockers improved survival of high-risk patients having non-cardiac surgery. And Poldermans and another member of the steering committee of the DECREASE trial, Geronium Bax, were involved heavily in the European Society of Cardiology. They were on the practice guidelines committee, and Poldermans chaired the task force which produced guidelines. And therefore, as a result of this, the European Society of Cardiology produced guidelines recommending perioperative beta blockers for this group of patients. And then it was shown that 5 of the DECREASE trials, research misconduct was involved. The first DECREASE trial, all the data was lost, so we don't know if that was also problematic. Subsequently, a meta-analysis of 11 credible trials, in fact, showed that perioperative beta blockers increased mortality by 27%. And it's been estimated that as a result of this falsification, about 800,000 patients in Europe, about 10% of them in the UK, may have died as a result of Poldermans fraud. Now, I say Poldermans fraud, you may, because they said that Poldermans was solely responsible. And you may ask, how can one individual falsify the data of numerous multi-center trials? And what were the rest of the steering committee doing? This guideline was amended earlier this year, and one of the members of the steering committee, Professor Bax, wrote over 500 papers in 10 years with poldaments. That's one a week. And he became president of the European Society of Cardiology. This is his profile in the Lancet, presumably written by Lancet staff. It contains a number of statements that are provably untrue. But most importantly, it talks about all the people that Bax had worked with. For example, it starts, a conversation with the eminent cardiologist Eugene Brumwald fueled Geranium Bax's interest. Now, I'll come on to Eugene Brumwald later, but this profile in the Lancet is quite interesting. It doesn't mention the one person he worked with most, which was Poldemans. But when Bax himself gave his inaugural professorial lecture, he thanked Poldemans. Nowhere in Netherlands cardiology can one find such a great partnership as we have built. Although I was frequently asked to reduce cooperation with Poldemans, I'd never done so. And later, when Poldemans was exposed, Bax refused to explain what this last bit meant. Who had asked him? Why had they asked him to reduce cooperation? And you may come to your own conclusions. Now, I want to also talk about this paper. This is in the Lancet. You don't need to read the text because I'm going to highlight the important bits a bit later. It was clinical transplantation of a tissue-engineered airway. And the first author was Paolo Macerini. And the last author was Martin Birchall. And they were co-principal investigators. The second author is Philip Youngblood. And I'll mention all of those names later. So those are the three names you need to remember. This is the patient, Claudia Castillo. Now, she had her left main bronchus replaced in Barcelona by Macerini with an airway supposedly engineered in Bristol in Birchall's laboratory. And the main claims are the two sentences in black. The graft immediately provided the recipient with a functional airway, improved her quality of life, and had a normal appearance and mechanical properties at 4 months. And the patient had no anti-donor antibodies and was not on immunosuppressive drugs. That second sentence is probably true, but the first sentence is entirely untrue. We know because a newly appointed medical director in Barcelona a few years ago informed the Lancet that there was no improvement in lung function and that the transplanted airway collapsed after 3 weeks and therefore needed a stent. So if it collapsed, it didn't have normal mechanical properties. And if it had a stent in it, it didn't have a normal appearance. Because when you put a bronchoscope down, you would see a stent which has a crisscross structure. Now, because she only had the graft to her left main bronchus, and when that collapsed and was never improved her function significantly, she could have her left lung removed and survive, and that's what's happened. The problem is that these individuals transferred this technology to people's trachea, and if you had a problem with your trachea, you cannot remove both lungs. You can do without one lung, but you can't do without both. Now, based on the success of this article, which was, received international press attention, Macerini first moved to Florence and then to the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, which of course awards the Nobel Prize for Physiology or Medicine each year. And he started doing tracheal transplants with fatal outcomes for patients. And he also had an honorary professorship at University College London for 5 years. And he got that because Martin Birchall had moved from Bristol to UCL to do tracheal transplantation with fatal outcomes for patients such as Shauna Davidson and Kezia Shorten. And these are the people. Kezia Shorten was 19, Shauna Davidson was 15. Shauna Davidson died the day after discharge from Great Ormond Street, 15 days after the operation, when her trachea collapsed and she suffocated. Kezia Shorten had a long, lingering death on the ITU at University College Hospital. And Maturini was eventually exposed and his contract was terminated in 2016. And in 2017, a national inquiry by a committee in Sweden found that he and Ljungblöf and others were guilty of misconduct. They requested retraction of 6 publications that had come from their research at the Karolinska. And subsequently, Maturini got criminal convictions in Italy for what he'd done in Florence and in Sweden. But the Lancet, despite knowing of the research fraud, the Lancet has refused repeatedly to retract either the 2008 paper, the original paper, or a 2014 follow-up paper by Gonfiotti. Now, the senior author of the Gonfiotti paper is also Maturini, and Ljungblöf and Maturini were the writers of that paper. And they've resisted requests even from the Science and Technology Committee and the Health and Social Care Committees, who have, for example, their chairpersons, because one was a woman and one was a man, they jointly wrote to the editor of the Lancet asking him to explain why he hadn't done anything about the 2008 paper. The Gonfiotti paper, the senior author, as I say, was Maturini, and only Maturini and Ljungblöf were authors of both the 2008 and 2014 papers. And the text says that they effectively wrote the papers. The 2014 paper made many false claims, including the claim that the body of the graft was first stented 29 months after transplantation, when we know it was actually stented 3 weeks after transplantation. And there are many also false images. And I'm going to just show you a few of them. The image on the top left is from the Gonfiotti 2014 paper, and it's a histological slide, or a bit from an histological slide. And that tissue, according to the paper, was taken in June 2012. But in fact, it's actually the same image which appeared in another Lancet paper earlier in 2012, and in fact was submitted to the Lancet in August 2011, 10 months before it was said to be taken by in the Gonfiotti paper. So the Lancet knows that this image is false. You can see it's a section that's been rotated, and they've altered the red-blue balance of the image, but it's clearly the same image, just by rotating it and altering the red-blue balance. But that image was in the Lancet before it was taken, according to the Gonfiotti paper. The same is true of this image. This from the same paper by Badilak. The senior author is Maturini. You can see it's the same tissue, except in the earlier Badilak paper, to get it to look like the Gonfiotti paper, what you do is you crop it, you stretch it a bit, and you reduce the contrast, but you get the same image. But not only have they used images from Badilac paper that was submitted earlier. There are images from another paper in which Macchiarini was senior author, and you can see this is a paper from 2010. I could show you other examples, and in fact, Macchiarini has used some of these images on other occasions where they claim to be yet other things than which they claim to be in the Gonfiotti paper. And yet the Lancet has not retracted these, and they should be able to see quite clearly we're talking about misuse of images. Birchall is still at UCL, and UCL is refusing to instruct Birchall to retract the 2008 paper. I don't know if this is anything to do with it, but Birchall has brought in at least £14.5 million of public money funding to continue tissue engineering of airways for transplantation. Birchall is the second author of the Lancet Commission on Stem Cells and Regenerative Medicine, and Richard Horton is an honorary professor at UCL, Horton being the editor of the Lancet. So there's a lot of connections which amount to conflicts of interest and may influence the management of this fraud. Now, I got interested in this 40 years ago when I did research on a drug called Amrinone made by Sterling Winthrop, which was now part of Sanofi. And I was doing work on a drug for heart failure and found it to be both ineffective for treatment of heart failure and unsafe. And initially, when I told the company, they just asked me to alter the data, and as if that was the sort of thing that you do with a researcher. And they seemed rather surprised when I said, I can't alter the data. And then they offered me the equivalent of 2 years' salary just not to publish it. And I said, well, patients have taken part in this research. There's an obligation for us to publish because they've taken part in research that might be dangerous, in fact, was dangerous. Then they made legal threats. But we went ahead and published. And when we published, I was on the side of one of our papers, got a number of papers, one of them on the side effects of the drug, and it had horrific side effects. I was contacted by Dr. Offerhouse from the Netherlands Committee for the Evaluation of Medicine, the regulator in the Netherlands at the time, before the European Medicine Agency was set up. And he said he didn't understand my paper on side effects of Amrinone because he'd got copies of my clinical records form submitted by Sterling Winthrop, and these side effects were not on it, or not in the clinical records forms. And I said, well, I've got the imprint copies, the under copies, and we compared what I'd got and what he'd got, and what he'd got were forgeries. So this is a pharmaceutical company submitting forged documents in order to get registration of a drug. But the following year, Sterling Winthrop had to admit to the US Food and Drug Administration that in the first 1,200 patients given the drug, there had been over 1,400 life-threatening side effects. So more than one life-threatening side effect per patient on average. And they said they were withdrawing the drug worldwide, both from marketing and from research. But 2 years later, I discovered that they were actually selling it over the counter in parts of Africa and Asia, when in Europe and North America, it was too dangerous to have on a doctor's prescription. And at a time when we then knew that it actually increased mortality by about 30%. And I got Oxfam, who had representatives in these countries, to buy the drug, get proof of purchase, and take it to the WHO and embarrass the company into withdrawing it worldwide. But I couldn't get any of the major journals to publish what had happened. I couldn't get regulators to prosecute the company in this country. And so I went to the Guardian newspaper, which carried the story on the front page, the back page, the whole of an inside page, subsequent studies. And that's how I got interested in this sort of problem. And around that time, Eugene Brumwald at Harvard, the most famous cardiologist in the world. The textbook of cardiology is Brumwald's textbook of cardiology. He was the first cardiologist to be appointed or elected to the National Academy of Science. He's the most cited cardiologist in the world. He was doing research, or research had taken place in his lab on amrinone. And my research contradicted his. And in fact, my studies were 4 times as large and did not, what I found did not agree with what he found. So I couldn't confirm the claims they'd made about the beneficial effects of the drug. And what also was a concern is that I noticed that although they claimed that all 5 of the authors worked at Harvard, 2 of them actually worked for the company, and 2 of them, Brumwald and Professor Grossman, were actually paid consultants to the company, which were not disclosed in the paper. Around the same time, there was a chap called John Darcy working in Brumwald's lab. And he was falsifying a large amount of data. And the inquiry into Darcy found that Brumwald had known that Darcy was falsifying research and let him continue working in the lab. The inquiry actually found that 83 papers were false. And I believe that to this date, only 17, about 1/5 of the false papers have been retracted. So that's a big problem, getting papers retracted, even when an official inquiry has shown they're false. Interestingly, across in San Diego at the same time, Bob Slutsky was working. And at his peak, he was publishing a paper every 10 days. It's believed, I think, that he's published something like 175 fraudulent papers, although most of them have not been retracted. And it was common knowledge in 1981. In fact, someone told me in 1981, and I was going to San Diego the following year, and they told me I'd meet Slutsky. And when I met him, he told me he made no secret of it. And people in the department, he said to me, even he knew that Darcy was a crook because Darcy is the only one who publishes more than me. People put their names on his papers knowing that he was making that up. And that's the interesting thing. It wasn't just they kept silent, they willingly put their names on papers. And the most interesting thing to me was, of course, the department in San Diego was the department that Eugene Brumwald set up before he moved to Harvard. And his deputy, when he was in San Diego, John Ross, became the head of department and became Slutsky's boss when Brumwald moved on to Harvard. And if you look back to when, before Ross and Brumwald had moved to San Diego, to when they were at NIH, there were a number of co-workers they worked with. And if you look at some of those co-workers, they've become professors in Europe and North America, and they've had research fraud scandals in their own departments. So I think there is a sort of web, there is an acceptance, even teaching or expectation that people will falsify research. I didn't do any industry research for decades until asked to be involved in this study more than 20 years later. You don't need to know why we were doing this research. We were putting a device in the heart which we hoped would relieve migraine. I won't give you all the background, you don't need to know that, but to understand this. The steering committee were Dr. Dowson, who was at King's College, London, a headache specialist. He's the director of headache services. I was the other co-principal investigator, and the other members of the steering committee were Dr. Michael Mullen at the Royal Brompton, and he received lecture fees from NMT Medical, the sponsor. The others were Keith Muir and Simon Nightingale, who were neurologists. But when the paper was published, you'll see that my name and Nightingale's name do not appear as co-authors because we refused to be authors of the paper, even though we were on the steering committee. You'll see that Mullen has now also declared that he owns shares in NMT, as did one of the other authors, David Hildick-Smith. Mullen also declared that besides teaching on our area, he acted as a consultant to NMT Medical. That's the disclosures in the paper. In fact, 10 of the authors were paid consultants to the company. And the reason that Simon Nightingale and I refused to be authors was that the investigators were denied full access to the data. It was obvious that the paper had errors and omissions. There were questions over the efficacy of the device and its safety, and conflicts of interest were not declared. A vice president company helped to write the paper. Dowson actually owned shares in the company, even though he did not disclose that as a conflict of interest. And he received approximately £2,000 a week from NMT for the 4 years that the trial was running. So that's £400,000, but he didn't declare any payments from NMT. And as I say, 10 of the authors were paid consultants to the company. I also discovered that Dowson had appeared, this was late on, that Dowson had appeared before the GMC because the General Medical Council that regulates doctors, a fitness to practice panel, because he had falsified data in an entirely unrelated trial. But the remarkable thing, you might think, is that the sponsor, NMT Medical, knew that he had falsified research in another trial when they appointed him to be the principal headache specialist in this trial. And you may say, that's bizarre. Why would they do that? Well, NMT actually appointed to be principal investigator in 2 US trials, a doctor who'd received a letter from the FDA saying he might face criminal prosecution for misconduct in trials. And of course, if you want someone who's going to be malleable and give you the result you want, you don't actually want someone who's honest, do you? If you want to be able to make sure that the paper says what you want someone who is not going to be by the book. You want someone who's prepared to bend a bit, or quite a bit if necessary. The mistrial actually was negative. In fact, 3 out of 74 patients who had the implant were migraine-free, and 3 out of 73 who had a sham procedure were migraine-free. So clearly it didn't work. NMT should not have known who the 3 that had the implant and were migraine-free were, because patients were only identified by an alphanumeric code. But those 3 patients were actually patients of doctors who had shares in NMT. So NMT did discover who they were, and those patients appeared on NMT's website on a rotating ballot headline, giving testimonials about the device. This is Zoe Willow. This is Liz Norwood. Alison Doughty also appeared on the front cover of their annual report. They appeared inside their annual report, but most remarkable, you got misinformation on NHS websites. This is the NHS website of the Royal Brompton Hospital, where Dr. Mullen, paid consultant, share owner in NMT, was a consultant. Says their study indicates that as many as 40% of patients could have their migraine symptoms significantly relieved through intervention to close the holes in their heart. But we showed it didn't work. Scroll down a bit. There you have Zoe Willow. I've now been completely cured and can live my life as a normal person. And a quote from Dr. Mullen, "This is significant news for migraine sufferers. For the first time, this study has shown that closing a PFO can have a substantial effect in reducing the symptoms for patients with severe migraine." But we showed it didn't work. Because I kept saying it didn't work, NMT sued me for libel and slander 4 times. That action lasted 4 years. My costs were 300,000, but I got most of that money back. I reported Dowson, and he had his second fitness to practice tribunal, and they found him guilty of dishonesty in the mistrial and suspended him from the medical register, but only for 4 months, remarkably short time. Dowson appealed, and in his judgment rejecting Dowson's appeal, the High Court judge, Mr. Justice Eadie, wrote, he, that's Dowson, now created a false document which was part of the records of the mistrial. So this is a High Court judge saying this is false and Dowson is dishonest. You may wonder then why the circulation has not retracted this paper. When I originally wrote to them, they did produce a 700-word correction, a data supplement, a new version of the paper, but all of those were written by Dowson. The new version of the paper still contains false statements and errors. It fails to disclose conflicts of interest. And the editors of circulation have seen the documents that clearly prove that this is false. The judgment is a public document. You can see it on the internet. You can see that what the judge and what the GMC say about Dowson's dishonesty. But it hasn't been retracted. Why has it not been retracted? This is a street in Boston, and the 2 buildings joined by the walkway are Harvard-associated hospitals. The building on the left is the Brigham and Women's Hospital, where Loscalzo, the editor at the time of circulation, was Eugene Brumwell's successor as the senior physician and senior cardiologist at Harvard worked. Across the walkway is where James Locke, senior pediatrician and pediatric cardiologist, worked. He was the senior pediatrician at the Boston Children's Hospital, and he was the inventor of the Starflex device. The patent for the device is owned by the Boston Children's Hospital on the right. NMT was a startup company in Boston set up to manufacture and market the Starflex device under license from the Boston Children's Hospital. James Locke and other Boston cardiologists were receiving royalties for sales of the device. At the time, I was trying to get Loscalzo to retract the paper. His department was receiving money from NMT for the Closure 1 trial, which also proved to showed the device didn't work. And in fact, it didn't work, so the company went into liquidation. But problems are not just in America. I complained about Edgar Southern when he was president-elect of the British Cardiac Society in 1986. I was a research fellow, and I pointed out that he'd falsified mortality data for coronary angioplasty and his dishonesty. And although the British Heart Journal published my letter, nothing was really done because he was president-elect of the society that half owned the British Heart Journal, the other half being owned by the BMJ Publishing Group. But Soughton's dishonesty was exposed later on, 3 years later. And in fact, you can read about that in Hansard, the record of Parliament, because it was discussed in a parliamentary committee. And what's interestingly, I also reported Soughton's one-time research fellow, Clive Handler. And he was found guilty of serious professional misconduct and suspended from the medical register for embezzling charitable research funds. And the most interesting thing about this was to me, that is, not only that you have a boss who's a crook and his deputy and his trainee who's a crook, but the way the hospital behaved. The hospital, the medical director of the hospital and the trust board agreed a settlements deal with Handler that if he went quietly, they would not inform the police and would not tell the GMC. That, of course, is wrong. No doctor who's aware of misconduct can fail to tell the GMC of misconduct by another doctor. That is a GMC rule. So if I'm aware of misconduct by another doctor, I must inform the GMC. But the remarkable thing about this was that at the time Richards was agreeing to conceal this from the GMC, he was a member of the GMC. In fact, he was chairman of its professional conduct committee, which subsequently was named the Fitness to Practice panel. He was in effect the GMC's senior judge, and he was concealing the misconduct from the GMC. You see, he was a dean of a medical school, pro-rector at Imperial College. He was the chairman of the Council of Deans of UK medical schools and faculties. And bizarrely, he put himself down to hear Handler's case. And on the morning, the GMC's own lawyers objected, saying he can't do this. And they asked them, the GMC, to stop him hearing the case. And so Richards had to recuse himself from the case on the morning. It was actually like going into the old, I say it's like going into the Old Bailey to a murder trial. And the judge says, sorry, I can't hear this case. They tell me I can't hear this case because I helped the accused bury the body. And so they took him off the case. They found someone else to chair it. But then they allowed Richards to return to hearing other conduct committee hearings. I reported Banerjee, the GMC, for research fraud. He was found guilty of serious professional misconduct. But the important thing is that senior officials at King's College in London had known about the fraud, had concealed it for a decade, that they let him submit the fraudulent research for a Master of Surgery degree from London University. London University knew it was fraudulent when they awarded the degree. And Banerjee's supervisor, Tim Peters, who supervised the research, was the Associate Dean for higher degrees for London University. So he was the dean for the degrees that Banerjee was being allowed to get, even though he was submitting false research. Peters was the editor of 2 journals. Another professor, Professor Kakar, signed to say that he had supervised the research, but he can't have supervised it. One, because it wasn't in his field and he wouldn't have known how to supervise it because it was in laboratory-based biochemistry and Kakar was a surgeon. But 2, it was entirely made up. So you can't supervise something that is, every word of it is fabricated. Banerjee actually did no research at all. He just made up paper after paper. By the time he'd been qualified 18 months, he had 49 publications. Banerjee was suspended from the medical register for a year, but I complained to the GMC. They hadn't actually dealt with all the issues around him. And then they had a second hearing, got him struck off. But even if you're struck off as a doctor, you can apply to get back on after 5 years. And he got back on after 5 years. And in 2014, he came to my attention again when he got an MBE for services to patient safety. This is a chap who's been removed twice from the medical register. And I complained to the Cabinet Office and various MPs and his local radio station. And he forfeited his MBE 2 months later. It was quicker, that was quite quick. They discovered that he'd actually bribed someone to nominate him for the MBE. And it took 24 years until 2015 to get Banerjee's Master of Surgery degree withdrawn by London University. And in the process, King's College London threatened to sue me 3 times in 1997, 2002, and 2014. Each time I had a big effort to try and get this withdrawn. They kept threatening to sue me. So this is one occasion when I wrote this article on institutional corruption in medicine about, and you'll see that it contains the footnote that documentary evidence corroborating this article was supplied to the BMJ. But if you want to read that article on the BMJ's website, you can't read it. That has not been retracted. You'll see it says at the bottom, this article has not been retracted, but for legal reasons, it's been withdrawn from the website. That's because King's College London threatened the BMJ. It was true. They knew it was true. Their lawyers had said it can be published. So here we have something you can't read, even though it's true. Whereas in the Lancet, you can still read the Macchiarini stuff, even though it's false. One last thing, Patrick Parfrey, he had 2 papers in the Lancet in 1981. 7 months later, his co-authors wrote to the Lancet and retracted them because the patients did not exist. You'd think that was the end of Parfrey's career. He moved to Canada, became the chief of neurology, professor of medicine, and latterly the associate dean for clinical research for the Eastern provinces of Canada. So the fact that you're known to be a fraudster doesn't stop your career advancing in medicine. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Peter. That's a really fantastic talk. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah, Kate?
I'm just interested in how you have managed to stay and continue under such pressure. It's just wonder how you managed to do that through these things. It's impressive.
So the question was, how has Peter managed to stay sane under all of this pressure?
Well, I don't know that I am sane really, but I actually, I try and look on the, it's appalling, it's awful, but I also, in a way, think, isn't it amusing? I mean, it's unbelievable that these things happen. You have to. I sort of think of it slightly oddly that it's farcical. You couldn't make it up almost, could you really, this sort of thing? And I don't know, I just, I've had fairly good support from family and, very good support from wife and kids and so on. How do they stay sane? I don't know. But, yeah.
Leonid?
So I have a question. So people nowadays say, look at the paper mills and say, look what happened to science, it's a complete fraud, massive fraud. And they say, all those golden days, science was still good and pure. And you just showed us the results of over 40 years ago where there was a one-man paper mill operating that people inventing all the time, like energy. So do you think there was ever good, happy golden times where the science was honest?
No, I don't know if it's better or worse now, but I don't think it was pure when I was young. No, there was still the pressure to publish, and there was still, to advance your career. So, I know lots of, I know a number of professors who've and heads of department around British medical institutions who've made up data that's in their MDs. And some of them, virtually all of their MDs or PhDs are fabricated. It's very interesting because there have been a number of studies that in both Europe, in USA and in Britain, which have shown that over half of medical students are prepared to be dishonest in order to advance their progress through medicine. But the interesting thing is a study from was done, I think, in Dundee, which looked at medical students in their time as they went through medical school. And in the first year, less than 20 showed any signs of dishonesty. But by the time they come to their 5th year, over 80% are prepared to do things that are dishonest to get a better mark, to get on with their career. And I always say that the purpose of a medical school is to convert an 18-year-old who wants to work for Médecins Sans Frontières into a 23-year-old whose ambition is to be a Harley Street cosmetic surgeon.
Bettina?
Yeah, I think what I come bringing the two talks together, I wonder what your opinion is of David's suggestion for peer review. What do you agree with that? What would you think is the way forward?
Yeah, so the question is, Bettina's asked what Peter's opinion is of the suggestions David made regarding peer review.
Yeah, well, I agree, essentially. I mean, I put my peer reviews on my annual appraisal every year. So when I do a peer review, I put it on my annual appraisal. I sign all my peer reviews. I take them conscientiously. I am actually rather surprised by the way that some people do not. In fact, I don't actually do any peer reviews for journals that are that I consider predatory. I just don't even open the invites, really. But decent, sensible journals, I do peer reviews. I always sign them. But I don't put the, I mean, it's sort of confidential, semi-confidential. So I don't put them on my appraisal, but I put what I reviewed on my appraisal for, so my appraiser can see them each year. I think that's important, and I'd be happy for them to, you know, if after an article appeared, my peer review appeared, because I'm happy that I've done that as best I can. But I'm also struck by the fact that many peer reviews are done very quickly. I mean, I did a peer review, and both I and another reviewer suggested comments to the authors, and there was a second version sent in, and the other peer reviewer had clearly not read it, because the second version sent in was the original version. He hadn't changed it, and I don't know if this was an error or he just was pulling a fast one. You know, he just submitted the original version by mistake, or, you know, whichever the author submitting the paper was, the corresponding author. But the other reviewer said, "Oh, thanks very much. The authors have dealt with my criticisms." Well, they clearly hadn't, because it was unchanged. So he hadn't even bothered to read the second version sent in.
So we'll have one more question from the floor, and then I see we have some questions in the comment box. So Taya, did you have a question?
Yes, please. Thank you very much for speaking for this extraordinary and terrifying talks. I was just looking around and, you know, seeing those pictures of great men, and what I see in connection with your talk is privilege and power and class structure, and those are reflected in a way from the medical institution. And there is, you know, the journals, all of these things of class and prestige that impact that. And I wonder if you think that we need to go for a reform of medical education, because I don't understand why medical students will not be taught what we are talking here about classification, taught about pressure, taught about, you know, development the critical ability to recognize those power structure they are regimented in from the first year medical. Because if they will be able to see that, to recognize it, and to address it, that's the way we grow. Healthy individuals will not go into these practices. Because right now, the whole system, the peer review system, the professorship, the research, the grants, everything, it's set up in a way that will make those misconducts flourish.
Yeah, except, I mean, they do get taught. I mean, I in fact, last Wednesday, I gave a talk on this topic, essentially, or some of this, to students at Imperial last Wednesday. So they do get some talks, but of course, doctors are human like other people, and if they see they can get on better by falsifying things, some of them will do it, and quite a lot will. So I think what you actually have to do is make it have severe punishments. That's what you need to do, and have severe sanctions. And people realize they can't get away with it because institutions do proper investigations, or not necessarily institutions, there are bodies that would do proper investigations. I think you need an independent body with trained people. I mean, we take art fraud seriously. We have the police who have trained art fraud detectives who just do art fraud. And no one dies from art fraud, just millionaires get fleeced, don't they? So we ought to have trained investigators who deal with scientific fraud and punish people appropriately. And that's the only way it could work, I think.
So final question.
Well, I want to thank you to all the speakers about the great help and also to you, Patrick, because I think that this should be like open spoken in all the research environment. My question is and also a comment because it's related about what Peter has said, specifically with colleague here. It is okay, what we are doing as institutions, to have a fair treatment of the research misconduct. Because if you have a case of research misconduct, probably here in Liverpool is going to be treated people they are going to deal in one way. But in other university, it's going to be treated in a different way. And there's no standardization of how the research misconduct, despite the fact that we know which research misconduct is, but we are not dealing in the same way with the institutions. So as long as this won't be standardized, we are still perpetuating this kind of practices. And also what is doing, and maybe someone from the attendant can help me with this, if someone can point me out that what the founders they are doing with people that they have been granted with grants that they come from our taxes, and they're making research misconduct.
Yeah, so the comment there was that there's probably a lack of standardization in how research misconduct cases are dealt with across the UK, and probably that some universities do a better job than others, and a comment about what research funders are doing about cases of research fraud. So I think before we get on to the questions for the discussion, I'll just pick out a couple of things from the Zoom chat. So David Volks has made an important comment that many pub peer commenters only do so because they have the protection of anonymity. Dorothy Bishop has said, I think it's more important that peer review, whether before or after publication, is openly available than whether it's anonymous. And if you can read the peer review, it's easier to pick up on things like paper mills. And Matt Hodgkinson says that there is an example of a publisher research integrity team that is doing that work. Let's see. David Colquhoun says that Peter Wilmshurst is a hero.
Right?
Valerie O'Donnell says the UKRI committee have stated that legislation needs to be changed if they were to consider the oversight role, which was discussed at the start of the session. Do we have information on what that legislation is? Because as a funder, can't you see T&Cs on funding awarded to cover this? So does anybody want to come in from the Zoom chat to comment on that point? Can we see if anybody's?
Sorry.
So can I see if anyone has a hand? Oh, okay. Can I always?
Hello, can everyone hear me?
Okay.
Someone's there now.
Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Okay.
hi.
Am I echoing?
So is that Rebecca?
Yes, sorry. This is Rebecca Beach. I'm from UK Research and Innovation. So I was,
Yes.
would you like me to come in on that?
Yeah, yes, please.
Okay,
Yes.
so UKRI was created from the Higher Education and Research Act in 2017. I can put the link in. That guides what we can and cannot do, but it states what we are as an organization set up to do. One of the things we're not set up to do is to be a regulator. And so we had to be very careful when we looked at establishing the committee about what its role would and would not be.
Yeah, so thank you for that comment. And I guess that leaves us with the question, well, you know, who is to provide this role? Because I think it is a role that's, you know, definitely needed. So if not the new committee, Corrie, then, you know, who is prepared to take on this role?
So do you want me to come in on that one, or is that a question for everyone?
Well, it's an open question, really.
Because I'm quite happy to give you my perspective on it, but I'm sure that there are many of them. But certainly from my perspective at UKRI, it's something that we're very interested in. We knew it was not something we could do. We're very hopeful that that's something that the committee will look at and to see what can be done in this space. But I think in reflection on what you've heard today from so many of the stories, I don't think there's a way to ever solve issues around research integrity and research misconduct if it's ever going to be, in a sense, devolved to one organization or one type of an organization. As a funder, we see us as having a responsibility. There's a lot of work we do in this space, from changing what success looks like through our resume for research and innovation, to having our first open access policy, to updating our policy on the governance of good research practice, looking at talent coming into the system and encouraging and supporting people in the system. But we would never say that we've got the only role to play, and we certainly see an important role for everyone else. And specifically when it comes to research integrity, it's something that we feel needs to be embedded across all roles and all positions, right across the research system and the research cycle. So it shouldn't just be the PIs or those in positions of making decisions that have that power. It has to be everyone. It has to be everyone working in research. So not just the researchers, the staff that are administrators in the institutions, those that are publishers and working with them. I don't see that this is going to be something that's solved unless everyone is on board and working towards the same thing.
Okay, so thanks for that, Rebecca. I think Dorothy Bishop has a question or a comment.
Yeah, can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes.
I can't make myself, I can't undo my video, so I'm sorry, I'm static. I do think it's unsatisfactory because, I mean, we've had two excellent speakers giving us examples of this sort of thing going on for literally decades. And it's not changing. It's extremely serious for science. If anything, it's getting worse with now the industrial scale fraud from paper mills. I mean, I don't think UKRI should be a regulator, but surely they should do due diligence about the expenditure of government money on research funding, which if people are using research funds to generate fraudulent research, I would have thought that has to be something that the actual funders who are responsible for use of government money should play a role in controlling. It's not quite the same thing as saying that you're a regulator, but it's otherwise we are just wasting a huge amount of money, quite apart from the very negative influences that our speakers have told us about, which are really very corrosive for science. So I think it's all very well to say, yes, the culture has to change, everybody has to change, everybody has to be on board, but how long are we going to wait for that to happen? Meanwhile, we have a lot of people doing things that are fraudulent and knowing that they get away with it. And that, I think, is part of the point of this meeting, is that many of us who have been involved in exposing fraud and other things feel initially that once we've provided watertight evidence of fraud, that our job is done, and there'll be somebody that we hand it over to who will then deal with it. And it's shocking when you discover this is just not the case. And it's clearly not just one person that finds it. This is a repeated story again and again and again, that we're all pussyfooting around, but nobody's actually sort of grasping the nettle of deciding what to do about it. And I feel the UKRI response is disappointing, and that my personal sense is that you don't need to necessarily classify yourself as a regulator to take some action on this front.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Dorothy. I think that's a point very well made. We have Valerie to
Yeah, thank you, Trish. I mean, I completely agree with everything that's been said here today, and echo everything that Dorothy has just said as well. And it leads me to the question, if UKRI aren't a regulator, how do we lobby to get a regulator set up in this space? What's the process for getting a regulator put in place? I'm not sure if there was meant to be a lady also coming from the Science and Technology Select Committee. If she's here, maybe she knows a little bit more about the process on that. And also Norman Lamb is here as well, I think. So maybe there's some others who know about the processes for recommending and trying to get a regulator put in place. If UKRI don't see it as their role, how do we do this?
Yeah, any comments on that? Yes, Leonid?
Well, I have a comment about the aspect we didn't mention. Well, actually, you mentioned it indirectly. So the case of carbon approach only got kind of solved because of New York Times reporting. So we keep discussing about whom to appoint to investigate, which board set on national board, and who will sit on it and discuss what. There were science have been taken with dealing with fraud for many decades behind closed curtains, behind closed doors. And if it doesn't matter how many boards we appointed, or it doesn't matter whom we put on it, it will still keep covering it up and doing nothing. So as long as the things are not getting into the public, and this is where the journalists come in, nothing at all will happen. And so this is the case is very short with partly evidence. It's only happened because whistleblowers found the possibility to post things online. But even on paper, nobody reads it, so you still journalists to inform people about it, things like that. So this is an aspect. I think this is an important aspect that nobody will discuss. It's not that we need to appoint regulators upon regulators upon regulators, but we need to bring transparency into science, which doesn't exist, because scientists think everybody should stay out of it. They're not qualified. We are intellectually and genetically superior people. We will solve it amongst ourselves.
But yeah, I think that's exactly the answer, that we can't solve it. You can't have self-regulation. We're talking about millions and millions of pounds being misused. We're talking about people being harmed. And you need laws and proper investigation by independent people, not people who've got scientific training, because you've got to understand the science, you've got to understand the statistics. But you need special investigators who are independent, who have legal powers to compel universities to hand over documents, and you want to put some of these people in prison. Poldermans is not in prison. I mean, he ought to be in prison if he's led to that sort of number of deaths. He should be in prison somewhere. It is a problem because it's often international. That's the problem. You may be collaborating, you know, researchers in different countries can make life difficult, but certainly in this country, we should be putting research fraudsters, people who've misused thousands of pounds, in prison.
But you need to create pressure for
Yeah.
people to act on the research process, and the pressure will be created if the scientific community and the general public are informed about what's going on. Otherwise, the pressure is not there.
So we have a comment from David Colquhoun.
Yes, I just wanted to say that, well, in 2011, I was sitting next to Mark Walport at a meeting about open data and so on. It's been going on a long time, these discussions. And I commented to the audience, not to him, that it was puzzled me that medicine, the caring profession, seemed to be more corrupt than any other. Do you think that's the case? I did qualify it by saying maybe it's just because there's more money available, but I don't think most of these cases are bribery by pharma companies, are they? They're mainly just vanity driven, as far as I can see. But I do agree with Peter Wilmshurst that regulators simply don't do it. And I started off blogging a lot about alternative medicine, where almost every paper is execrable. 30 journals devoted to alternative medicine are indexed in PubMed as though they were real journals, but of course they're not. And there are regulators for alternative medicine, and they do nothing but promote it. That's in effect. They don't care whether things work or not. There's every time something seems to get into the hand of a big organization, whether it's a regulator or a university, excuses are made for people. They're not effective. Perhaps people should be in jail for doing these sorts of things. Perhaps it's the only way that it'll work.
Yeah, so maybe I can just make a comment. So, I mean, you know, one way this could work would be, you know, if universities you know, fail to deal with research misconduct appropriately, that we then have a national committee that the person bringing the complaint can appeal to, and that this committee should actually be paid for by government money and should sit under UKRI, and this should be part of our REF assessments. And if we have universities or other organisations as well, you know, including research institutes, that are failing to deal with research misconduct appropriately, then they face financial penalties, because I feel that that is really the only thing that is going to make universities improve in this area. Since the Research Integrity Inquiry, you know, published its report, you know, my sense is that research misconduct is actually become more prevalent, yet we have universities banging on about how they're all adhering to the Concordat and, you know, how they value research integrity, but actually, you know, things aren't moving in the right direction. So I think this is really something that, you know, we desperately do need. So I don't know if anybody wants to come back on that. You know, whether it be Corrie or we need another committee to do that role, you know, I'm not really sure, but I think it's a role that is desperately needed. So we have a hand up from Andrew Weeks.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you so much for organising the seminar. I think that it's publicity like this actually is very important, because I think the element of shame for big universities and big institutions is an important side of it. which is why I think that it's important then to publish data on this, and organizations like Retraction Watch to publicize fraud, I think is important and does have its effect. But there's clearly different areas which need to be addressed. There's the whole area of the GMC regulation of doctors. The area which concerns me particularly, coming from a sort of Cochrane and guidelines and WHO guidelines background, is how we protect patients essentially from this fraudulent data becoming practice. And a lot of that is trying to get high quality guidelines and trying to somehow insulate the guidelines from the sort of poison which is out there. Now, what we've done in the past is to use peer review journals as our test of good quality. And you say, well, so long as it's peer reviewed, actually, therefore it must be good quality. But the speakers have very eloquently shown really how peer review really isn't, it shouldn't be the test of high quality. And just because something is published doesn't mean that it's good quality. And somehow we need to put, we need to have some way of regulating journals. And Peter and I have discussed this by email previously about how we try and get some kind of, like Athena Swan or CQC or something like that, to regulate journals. And to me, journals might be interested. I know Peter disagrees, but to me, journals might be interested in, because there's now so many journals, how do you know which are the quality journals and which are not the quality journals? And if you've got some kind of regulatory framework which says these are the good quality journals, these are the approved UKRI approved journals, or the something approved journals, because they examine original data from at least 5% of papers submitted. They have a system whereby they regulate fraud. They've got robust committees, etc. If you've got some way of approving certain journals, then those can be the ones which would be then the arbiters of sort of good practice, and all the other predatory journals sort of will fall away and will just become chatter on the internet. They say, I mean, we don't just pick up anything written on the internet and say, oh well, it must be true, I read it on the internet. Well, I guess some people do, but most people don't. And that's where these other predatory journals should be, the paper mills should be discarded too. So to me, that's where the challenge is in trying to get good quality regulating of good quality journals. And I'm not quite sure how to do it, but I think that's where the fight needs to be, to protect patients so the guidelines are good quality.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that, Andrew. So Deborah, would you like to comment on that?
Yes,
I'm just wondering, would you like to come up here so the people on Zoom can hear? Oh, it's okay. We have a roaming.
It's difficult to hear actually all the questions. We've not really been able to hear online, so thank you for doing that.
Oh, sorry.
So my name's Deborah Khan, and I'm trustee of COPE, the Committee on Publication Ethics. I think what you've just suggested, we've just heard from these two wonderful speakers examples of papers in the Lancet, in the New England Journal of Medicine, in Science, in Cell, which are all journals which would many people would have at the top of the list of the high quality journals, because all of the things that you suggest that you judge a journal by, they will probably do what they say. So there are the issues, I think, that we've been talking about today are systemic across journals, institutions, funders, and sometimes governments. And I think we do need a regulator. We do need all those people together to collaborate, to come to the conclusion about what it is that can be done, but something needs to be done. The issue is also international, and we talked about paper mills, which many of them are based outside Europe and the US. So it's going to require collaboration internationally and across all sorts of organisations to be able to move things forward. I think there's the will to do that, and I think that if this can do anything, I think trying to get those organisations together to talk would be a very thing, something that Hope certainly wants to do, working with other organisations such as PARI and others to try to make things work differently.
Yeah, thanks a lot for that. Leonid?
So this debate about regulating journals is decades old. We have PubMed, we have impact factor, we have who knows what telling us which journal is a good one and which is a predatory one. In the end, it turns out they're all predatory, and they're all trash, and they all publish paper with fraud. So maybe the problem is the scientific publishing in itself, and please can you stop regulating things because it doesn't work. It just create jobs for people who probably can do something more useful.
Yeah, so I mean, one of the things that I've been thinking about to, help with the problem of the predatory publishers, which seems to be more and more of them all the time. We currently have a model where we pay to publish, and this, this is why we have so many of these. Well, what if we got away with the pay to publish model, and instead, which is actually what's happening now already, with some of our universities, that we just pay a fee to the publisher, and then we can read all of their articles and publish there for free. And then we would expect the publishers to make an altruistic gesture that, other members of the public would be able to access the articles for free, and then everybody's should be happy. The publishers are getting some money, and we can hopefully get rid of these awful predatory publishers from the system. So I don't know if anybody has any thoughts on that and whether it could work. Maybe something. Yeah, David.
So to address this is David Sanders, to address the comments of Andrew Weeks, I think there are two problems. We can potentially solve one of them by approved journals. So the issue of predatory journals versus the problems with articles in the literature in general, I think that those are two separate problems. And I would argue, I noticed in a comment that lists of approved journals will work. If we have a system where government funds are being used to publish, let's assume that in some form that continues, I do think that there should be journals that you are not allowed to use government funds in order to publish. So that partially deals with the predatory journal. It doesn't ensure the quality of the scientific literature, but it does deal with the issue that we have a whole ecosystem that pretends to be science, but has fake peer review, and it allows certain people to publish in an ecosphere that is not actually reflective of solid science, but it also, as has been mentioned, influences the public in ways. I had that journal I mentioned before. A friend of mine was diagnosed with cancer and contacted me and said, do this. I looked in and I saw this article in that particular journal. Should I follow the advice that's provided, about my particular cancer? I said, absolutely not. It's not really a peer-reviewed article. It's just a vanity press. and people are able to publish virtually anything there. So we won't address the whole issue, but I do think that not allowing publication to use funds for publication is actually a positive step.
Yeah. Andrew mentioned journals checking a proportion of the submitted articles, and I think that's absolutely right. In fact, I wrote to the BMJ 35 years ago suggesting that, and they then got Drummond Rennie to review it, who was deputy editor of the Journal of the American Medical Association, I think at the time, and he said, well, actually, I've already written an article about this, which I hadn't seen. So I'm sure that's the right thing, but it is very difficult and time consuming, because if you're going to review a proportion of articles, people have got to spend a lot of time. But I think if you give them credit for looking at checking articles, then that would be good. And of course, if articles are then withdrawn, when you say, you know, by lot, we've selected your article to be checked, then you can publicize that. And I think when you've got problems from one author, you actually should publish notices of concern about all their publications, every one. I mean, Banerjee, in fact, was found guilty of falsifying very few papers, and people did not want to look at his whole gamut of papers for the simple reason that his co-authors included 2 presidents of the Royal College of Surgeons, 1 president of the Royal College of Physicians, and a Queen's physician. And they didn't want to look at those papers.
Yes, any other comments on the publishing issue? I mean, I'd also just like to raise the problem of commercial companies, you know, publishing fraudulent work as well, because, you know, they don't even come under the jurisdiction of universities, but I've often seen that they will publish a paper in a journal that's not peer reviewed, and then they put it on the website, and then they're advertising it to patients and other consumers. And of course, members of the public have no idea that this is a predatory journal. So, I mean, how we deal with that, I'm not really quite sure. So, Nina, did you want to make a comment on that?
Yeah. So, as I said, we must stop this discussion about predatory journals because they're all predatory. Yeah. I mean, you said yourself, it has their Baltimore name on it, it will cost you. Nobody will read into it. And people know that David Baltimore himself was involved in fraud. Even then, it doesn't matter. So everything is bad. We need to change the system. The system doesn't work. Because of COVID, things started to change positively. Because of COVID, scientists were forced to publish preprints. And a lot of absolute garbage research, what is the cure for COVID, which whatever it was exposed already at preprint stage. And it reached peer review. It was sometimes it didn't reach peer review. It was rejected. It was never made into a journal or published in very small. So we need to reform publishing completely. So preprints are one idea, but regulating journals will not work. We tried it for so long. It won't work. To define what is predatory journal, which is not won't work. Frontiers and MDPI are trash. I don't know if they sue like Frontiers. Send lawyers after Jeffrey Beal because they called him predatory, and MDPI did the same, so they were delisted. So officially they're not predatory, they're full of paper mill. Hindawi by Wiley is just a paper mill factory. So the system doesn't work and it can't be regulated. We must move on to a different publishing system. Maybe, I think preprints showed the way, and we started already because of the COVID to publish through preprints, and it improved. So that's my 2 cents.
Okay, so we're coming to the end now. So one of the things that I thought would be good to discuss is, you know, how can we better protect whistleblowers? Because, you know, if you're a student or even a lecturer and you're raising concerns about research misconduct about a senior person in your university, then the chances are that you're going to experience detriments. So what can we do to protect whistleblowers? Anybody have any thoughts on that?
I would say that that's very, very complicated.
Hang on, we should give you
Thank you. I would say that the protection of whistleblowers is very complicated. Like, I don't know if you came up with the case of Walter Danilo from the University of Vermont, like 18 years ago, when he reported his PI because he was falsifying data about the trend of cholesterol and menopause. And he has a case, and the protection for him, it wasn't very good, but at the end he changed his field and he became a cardiac thoracic surgeon, and he quit to nutrition. But that is one successful case because normally whistleblowers like universities, at least so far the universities that I know, if you check the policies or the organizers about whistleblowers, there's no policies for students. And normally they are treated as staff, which is absolutely different. And what you can do, like, from my personal experience, when I deal with the whistleblower case that I have been dealing with for a while, it was like where I should go first. Because like if you are a student, that all the career can be jeopardized. Like you can have like regulation, and there's not like a clear, like you need to do the things by your own. And if you are courageous, you can do it. But there's not a clear like advice that if you are a student, if you are, in my case, international student, what you can do. It's not possible. And I think that is a huge step that the universities and the institutions, the research institutions, they have with that, because if there are no policies that they are guaranteeing you that you will be treated fairly, people, they won't report anything. And the system and the research misconduct will perpetuate year and every single time. So it's like something important to do, because as I mentioned, like it's just a staff. And the institution, they care about their staff, not for people that they are paying to study in their institutions.
So thanks a lot for that comment, Teresa. Any other comments about whistleblowing and how we can better protect whistleblowers? I mean, I think really without this sort of oversight committee that, you know, checks that institutions are actually dealing with these cases appropriately, I don't really see how it can be achieved, because the case I mentioned in the introduction there, this is quite an interesting case because it went to an employment tribunal, and it's one of the rare cases where we really see what was going on behind the scenes amongst, you know, people from the senior leadership of the organisation concerned. And it was quite clear from the beginning that, you know, this person really had no chance of getting her case heard, and they were just really hell-bent on getting rid of her. And I think if we had an oversight committee, then it would hopefully stop, you know, those sort of things happening again. But as I say, I think it can only work if universities are financially penalised for behaving in this way, and I think that could be done through the ref. So we're almost at the end. Any final comments, Bruce?
Thank you. Not faculty, but on the issue of the ref, I think that is a very interesting suggestion that Trish made, because I think undoubtedly institutions might want to put more energy in. One thing I would identify, which I think is relevant to whistleblowers, but also more generally, is simply the sheer amount of time it takes for cases to actually come to an investigation. I do think that one of the problems is that, for example, at this institution, if a formal investigation takes place, you have two people from within the university, one from the outside. The burden on somebody from outside, an external investigator, which is clearly a good thing, can be extremely large indeed. So I think there are huge problems in actually finding people from the outside to sit on these panels. I think that is a problem for anyone who's in a whistleblower position. It's a problem for research integrity in wider terms, simply because of how long it takes for these issues to be addressed. So I do think institutions might want to think, how can we actually support external reviewers and potentially some kind of external oversight of that would be a good thing. Because at the moment we are asking colleagues to do what can be an extraordinary amount of work. I have sat on a panel of an internal. We were very lucky that our external member, the panel which had to meet for over a year before we finally found upholding most of the complaint. We were very lucky we had somebody from another institution who was willing to be tenacious, put in the work required. But this, I think, is something that is very hard to secure. That's why it takes so long to appoint panels.
Just a couple of questions. Are they these processes?
No, never. Yeah, never trust them.
I
It's
mean,
a problem.
because, for example, if you have external reviewers or members of the commission where they're revising a case, you never know who are they. It's
No.
like a kind of black box.
Absolutely, that's the whole point of it. It can be anybody on the spot. I've seen anything. So it's Sweden probably is the only.
Can it just, it's because the people on Zoom can't hear, so I think Peter wants to.
Yeah, well, actually, I think that you're wrong. I mean, I chaired a panel in Bangladesh, actually, which was set up, and that took me 3 months of my time. And they actually, because there is so much corruption in Bangladesh, they actually asked me, an American, and an Australian to be independent people on the panel. We had a lawyer from the Supreme Court advising on the law, and that the only other Bangladeshi was the chairman of the Medical Society, Medical Association. And it took 3 months of my time as the chairman of this. And 4 of the whistleblowers said that they'd received death threats, all from the same person, so it was quite credible. And they actually did their investigation far better than any investigator. Well, perhaps because I was chairing it, but modestly, but it was far better than most investigations I've seen by the GMC in this country. The other thing I'd point out, that much research in medicine in this country has nothing to do with universities. It's to do with hospitals, and they treat whistleblowers very badly. I mean, you've just seen a report about Birmingham, where they reported 26 people to the doctors, to the GMC in 10 years. And the GMC's own report that they commissioned showed that hospitals report whistleblowers to them as a punishment to try, because if you get a doctor struck off before the GMC, you can discredit them, and therefore you can discredit them as a whistleblower. And that's quite common. And in fact, the GMC threw out every one of the 26 cases that the QE in Birmingham reported to them over 10 years. So they were all without merit. But of course, what they will often do is sack people for reasons other than the fact that they are a whistleblower. They will come up with other excuses. That's what always happens. They will say, we're not sacking you, we're not making you redundant because you're a whistleblower. We don't believe you're a whistleblower. We're sacking you because we don't need this many members of staff in the department, or because you're too outspoken, you're upsetting the rest of the department. That's what they do. And that's what they get away with. It's not, and so we do need better protections. But the Chris Day case, which has been going on for 7 years, has shown the problems that the courts have of dealing with whistleblowers, because he, is a junior doctor who raised concerns and was sacked. And it was shown that under government rules, a junior doctor cannot be a whistleblower. That was what the courts decided. A junior doctor cannot be a whistleblower.
Yeah, so I'm just conscious that we've gone over our time. Does anybody want to make any final comments? Bettina?
Yeah, can we actually have a copy of the chat?
Yes, I think it should be possible, yeah. Yeah, we can do that, and I'm happy to circulate that to everybody afterwards, along with the recording. So, Jenna, did you want to make a no? Okay, so I think then we can just give both of our speakers a round of applause. And thanks very much to everybody who's joined on Zoom, as well as everybody who's come along in person. I think it's been a very interesting discussion, but I think this is really only the start of it, and I think we need to follow up with this. And Corrie are encouraging people to, you know, comment on what, how we think things can be improved in this area. So I'll also provide everybody a link to that so that they can make some comments. Okay, so bye everybody.